Among the discoveries of gold in the West, Last Chance Gulch really was one of the major discoveries, and some $19 million in 1860s currency was taken out of this place. Probably 10,000 miners were over the Continental Divide when gold was discovered at Grasshopper Creek, which was the first discovery here in Montana, the first gold rush anyway. And once word came that that discovery had been made, hordes of miners came from over the Continental Divide into Montana. And then, of course, there were boom, 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 3 great discoveries, one each year, 1862 at Grasshopper Creek, 1863 at Alder Gulch, which became Virginia City, and then here in 1864 at Last Chance. So we're standing here in the area that actually was the first commercial area here in Helena. And right behind me to the right-hand side is where the discovery was actually made back in 1864, July 14th. And the story goes that there were 4 miners who were kind of down on their luck, and they were prospecting around. They had depleted their supplies. They were on their way to Virginia City. You know, back at that time, this was a travel corridor for Native Americans. Generations and generations of Native Americans traveled through this area. This was full of pronghorn antelope, lots of grizzly bears, lots of rattlesnakes. There was a stream that ran basically right along where Last Chance Gulch, our main street, runs today. And so these prospectors had been this way before, and they were panning and they were coming along, and they decided to make camp for the night. One of them made quite a good discovery, showed color in his pan, is what they call it. And he made quite a bit of gold dust in this initial panning. So they knew that they had found a very special spot, and it was basically, as I said, where that building is today. The discovery was made right there. And so they camped and they panned a little more, and they decided they were going to have to go back to Virginia City to replenish their supplies, so they did. And as was common in these gold rushes, people observed other miners. And when they saw miners spending gold dust, a lot of these miners could tell by looking at the color of the dust where the gold came from. And they could tell that this was a new find. And so they watched these 4 men, and when they came back to their discovery site, very soon after that, other miners trickled in. By 1865, you know, there were probably 5,000 to 10,000 people here. That population diminished once the placer gold was depleted, or more or less depleted, and all the claims were taken. And so by 1870, the population here in Helena was 3,000. But it was the largest population center in the territory at that time. So behind me is the Pioneer Cabin, which is Helena's oldest documented dwelling. And we say that it's the oldest documented dwelling. At one time, there would have been cabins like this all up and down the gulch. But it is the only remaining one that we do have a building history for. And I'm going to invite you in. This portion here is the breezeway portion that was added later to connect the two original cabins. The back part here was the oldest part, built in 1864 by Wilson Butts, who came here from Missouri. And we'll come around this way, and I will invite you in. So Wilson Butts would have spent the winter time of 1864, 1865 in this cabin, probably mining out his back door and probably out his front door as well. This cabin is, in typical fashion, it's made of hand-hewn logs that were cut from around this area and then chinked and then whitewashed. Miners and housewives would typically whitewash their walls once a year because they would become blackened with soot from the wood stoves. And so this cabin reflects that practice, and it is very white inside. freshly done. The items that you see in the cabin are all of the correct time period. Some of the furnishings may have been original to the Butts family. We're not sure. There were a few things that were left in the cabin. This pie safe dates to about 1864, which would have been the correct time period, but it was left in the cabin, so we really don't know. Families from all over Helena who had pioneer ancestors who came to Last Chance Gulch donated items, and so all of the items, except for a few things like this pie safe, were actually donated to the museum. And there are some interesting things here. This is called a pole riffle, which is a very unique way of doing placer mining. It's basically just pieces of wood, unfinished and nailed onto a board, which probably was part of a wagon bed at one time. And the way that it works is that you would take a bucket of dirt and water and pour it over this. Gold is the heaviest element in the soil, so if there's any gold, it's going to stick in the crevices. And then you would take an implement, perhaps like this, and you would dig out the little tiny pieces of gold or flick out the dust. It's a very tedious way of doing placer mining, but very effective too. Possibly this was used by the Chinese. We did have a large population of Chinese miners living in Helena. I think my favorite thing in the cabin is this Civil War era bathtub called a hat bathtub. You have a place to sit, a place to put your soap so it doesn't fall into the water. Of course, you could only get your legs in there unless you were a little child. In the mining families, there was a tradition that the oldest person would have the first bath, and then they would work down to the youngest child. And by the time, in the mining families anyway, by the time the youngest child got the bath here, the water was pretty black. And so if you've ever heard that expression, don't throw the baby out with the bath water, that's because you don't want the baby to get lost in the dirty water there. This is also a really wonderful item. This is a chair, and it shows how resourceful our pioneers really were. This is a cutting board that was used to the point of just splintering. And this is a ox bow here that would have gone around the oxen's neck. The legs are just little peeled logs, peeled branches. And it really makes a pretty good sturdy chair. And so come with me into the front room. This room was built second. The breezeway was added probably in the 1870s to connect the two cabins. But these were originally two separate cabins. And in 1865, this room was built by Jonas Butts for his family. Wilson, his brother, had built the back room. And the family consisted of the mother, the father, and 3 little girls. And the family of 5 lived in this room while the bachelor uncle lived in the back room for about 2 years. All kinds of people came because of the gold rush. And you know, it was a place where people could come. A lot of people came to escape the Civil War. And so there were Civil War rivalries very early on in all of the mining camps, north and south divided. And there were people who came here staked by their communities, basically, and they had a lot riding on, you know, the fact that they really needed to discover gold to repay someone or a community who had financed their trip here. It wasn't a cheap thing to have to, you know, buy a team of oxen and buy supplies and come here. And so you have to remember that for every person that made a big discovery, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who drew blanks. It was really like a lottery. I do like to say that Helena is the town that gold built because although we don't have any industry here really, gold mining was the foundation. And those people who did strike it rich in the gold rush spent a lot of money in this community. We have just incredible mansions on the west side that were built with the gold rush. We have wonderful Victorian architecture that was built with money as a result of the gold rush. And you know, when you say that it's the town that gold built, not only was it the actual discovery of gold, but it was also the attendant industries that that helped to build this community. They say that there were more millionaires per capita here in Helena than any other place in the 1890s, but that's never been proven. It's a legend. But you know, it is a place where you can see the wealth that was poured into the community in the 1880s and 1890s, and it earned Helena the nickname the Queen City of the Rockies because of that.